Welcome everyone to another webinar of Governing Intimacies. This year, as many of you know, we are running an amazing series called Intimate Archives, Interventions on Gender, Sexuality and Intimacy. If you're interested, if you don't know the series, you can check previous episodes on our YouTube channel or on our website. So today we have a very exciting panel. The panel will be speaking on trans and queer African mobilities, and we are very glad to have everyone sharing the work with us. You are gonna hear in more detail about this project from the editors of the book. So the panel today is based on a forthcoming book that will be coming out next year. So I'm gonna, John Marnell, who is one of the editors, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just let me get my screen going. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. So hello again. It's absolutely wonderful that so many of you could join us today. It's a great privilege to be sharing some new research with you. And to be putting a spotlight on African queer and trans mobilities, a field of research that continues to receive very little scholarly attention. As Kayo said, my name is John Marnell, and with my fabulous colleague B. Kaminga, we are the editors of an upcoming edited volume on this very topic. So I won't be presenting on my chapter today, but I do have the honour of sharing a bit about the project and why it's crucial for scholarship in this field to take Africa seriously. And by that, I don't just mean Africa as a place where scholars can go to collect data, but rather as a site in which new theories and modes of critique are being forged. Because right now, in the literature, Africa and other global south locations are reduced to sites of displacement. That is, places from which queer and trans people flee in order to find safety elsewhere. And yet, as with most things, the reality is far more complex. And it's these nuances we hope to gesture towards today, and which the edited collection as a whole makes its primary intervention. By bringing together Africa-focused research in a dedicated volume, we hope to reposition the continent within queer and trans migration scholarship, transforming it from a simple footnote in a person's biographical narrative to a site in which many processes, displacement, transit, reception, belonging, and struggle all play out, often simultaneously. And so I think it's important to start off by acknowledging that academic interest in queer and trans mobilities has intensified in recent decades. This is, of course, a hugely positive development in that we are getting more and more insight into the socio-political factors that drive queer and trans people to leave their homes and on their experiences in various transit and reception countries. Yet, even with this growing scholarly interest, we continue to see the same tropes pop up. That is most evident in the orientation of queer and trans migration research, which remains overwhelmingly concerned with experiences in the global north. We are thankfully seeing excellent critiques of how global north states are responding to queer and trans migration, but even here, there is an entrenched assumption that protection and reception are prerogatives of the global north only. This is in spite of a fact that we have known for many, many years, and that is that the global south continues to host the vast majority of the world's queer and trans refugees, many of whom remain undocumented. So this privileging of south-north migration is problematic for a number of reasons. First, it implies that this is the primary, if not the only direction in which queer and trans people are moving. Second, it plays into the logics of neo-colonialism by replicating that all too familiar dichotomy of the barbaric African continent in opposition to the progressive West. Indeed, most accounts of queer and trans migration, no matter their form or intent, remain organised around a narrative of movement from repression to freedom. Such a framing contributes to homo-nationalist discourses by suggesting that states in the global north are best equipped to save queer and trans people from the south. Now, it's certainly important that researchers continue to interrogate the failings of global protection mechanisms, including how global north states violate domestic and international law. But, and this is very important, we run into trouble when this becomes the primary frame of analysis. So this fixation with host states in the global north feeds into an alarming myopia, one that continues to shape how queer and trans migration is approached, including who we imagine queer and trans migrants to be, where we think they are going, and how we understand their motivations and aspirations. Approaching research from a global north vantage point not only perpetuates certain readings of peoples and places, but also stifles the possibility for nuanced theorizations of local, regional, and global responses to queer and trans mobilities. We end up with little clarity on the specificities of leaving any one place, and even less of an understanding about the relationship between places left behind and those where asylum is sought. This is what we are trying to push back against by curating this body of research according to its geographical focus. We hope the collection points to the disparate catalysts, experiences, and outcomes associated with queer and trans migration on and from the African continent. These movements aren't necessarily unidirectional, nor can they be reduced to a singular oppression to liberation narrative. We must also be open to the possibility of African states being sites of becoming and belonging, even if they remain locations marked by violence and insecurity. And so on that note, I want to turn to today's seminar. I must say it wasn't an easy event to curate, given the breadth of scholarship we had available to us. What we have chosen to do is share inputs that speak to different geographies, specifically West, East, and North Africa, all of which usually play second fiddle to Southern Africa, or more correctly, South Africa, in the literature. We also want to use today as a platform to showcase the work of emerging scholars from the African continent. This is very important. If you go to most academic conferences and panels on queer and trans migration, you could be forgiven for thinking that there is no scholarship coming out of the continent. And this is, of course, very, very far from the truth. We were also keen to give a sense of some of the larger questions addressed by the collection. And there are three in particular we want to draw attention to today, and which hopefully we can unpack in more detail during the Q&A. And those are, how should we conceptualize queer and trans movement on and from the African continent? Are there more ethical ways to represent queer and trans Africans in the diaspora? And what social, political, and cultural dynamics are overlooked when scholarship is limited to legal critiques? These are questions that all three presenters will touch on today. And so I don't want to take any more time away from them, but it would be good to keep these questions in mind as you listen to the inputs. And so, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Yara Ahmed, who is a feminist researcher based in Egypt.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John, for this introduction. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're at. So my name is Yara, and I'm an independent researcher, like John mentioned, and I got my MA in Gender Studies from the American University in Cairo, and a BA in English Literature from the University of Alexandria in Egypt. So today I have 10 minutes, so I will share with you only a few ideas, reflections, like from the field and from the research that I discussed in the chapter in the book. And I was interested in looking at how queer people navigate geographies of persecution and securitization in Egypt, and to queer this idea of movement or mobility. Mobility, as I understand it in the context of my research, is something not contingent on actual kinetic movement, but also on the ability to imagine a somewhere else and sometime else, as a way of aspiring towards, quote unquote, a better life. So I will share with you my screen. Just give me a second. Okay. So I will start off by like the title of my chapter, Labyrinthine Wanderings, Queering Mobility in Impossible Geographies. So basically, I will talk about this idea of a labyrinth for starters. A few years ago, I read a short story by Jorge Borges. I'm sorry if the pronunciation is wrong. The short story is called The Garden of Working Path. In his short story, the protagonist came across a text written by his great ancestor, one he described as a long-lost labyrinth. We learned that his ancestor left his job as a politician in order to write a novel. but having died before finishing the novel, he left behind an indeterminate heap of contradictory drafts, to quote Borges, and a cryptic letter stating, "I leave to the various futures my garden of working path." The plot of the novel revolves around the protagonist trying to make sense of the mysteries of this labyrinth, a story with endless possibilities, storylines that diverge, draft upon draft of potential futures. That's how I made sense of my field. As queer bodies moved, navigated the multitude of ways to escape governance, sovereign violence, and objects of management and control, their movement did not play out as a mere transition from point A to point B, but as a working through a multitude of drafts, building futures, dreaming of other time spaces, migrating, hoping, waiting, and feeling stuck. Positivist approaches to knowledge often dismiss the imagination as something unreliable, not real, fictitious. It considers the imagination as a secondary form of knowledge, something akin to myth, stories, and anecdotes. But the imagination, however, offers a fertile ground to see mobility, and in that sense, also migration, highlighting the spatio-temporal aspects of movement, as well as the affective and the subjective dimensions. So going back to that idea of the labyrinth, in my field, I saw the body as a landscape for dream-making projects. So the body itself was a labyrinth where potential futures unfolded, were reimagined, reconstructed. These projects manifested in crafting a multitude of paths, dreaming of crossing borders, moving out of a parent's house, confessing an infatuation, or getting out of bed in the morning, imagining life is somewhere else, or could be something else. Eurocentric narratives on queer migration, like John mentioned, often think of the motives aspiring migrants as an outcome of a desire to move from a backward global south to an enlightened and progressive global north, or from an oppressive heteronormative state to a liberal homonational state. But the questions I asked in my chapter were, within a geography that is entrenched in a lot of violence, uncertainty, and fear, what happens when precarious queer bodies aspire for somewhere else? And what are the politics that surround their dream-making projects? And I will share with you a story from the field, starting with a quote by an interlocutor. "Anyone who is in a position where they feel endangered all the time, even if there is nothing that is actually threatening them, spend all their time dreaming. They're faced with two choices, either to start fixing where they are or just dream all the time. And even if they choose to fix where they are, they're fixing it because they dream of that somewhere else where they aren't worried about anything anymore." That's a quote from an interlocutor, Karim, to use a pseudonym, who was one of a few gay men who escaped arrest after the Egyptian state instigated a nationwide severe crackdown on queer people in September 2017 in Egypt. That particular crackdown was triggered after a few people raised rainbow flags during a concert that was held in Cairo by a band called Masrour Alain, a Lebanese band, whose lead singer is openly gay. After the concert, the Egyptian state implemented a series of violent measures against queer community, and more than 60 people were detained on charges of inciting debauchery. And Karim was one of those people who raised a flag with his friends during the concert. And as he shared his feelings with me, or fears, hopes, and plans, some of them changed, some of them he followed through with. It was as if I was witnessing a construction of a forever changing labyrinth, a navigation between what might be impossible and what might be possible. And what seemed to be impossible yesterday became possible today, and the other way around. But these possibilities, or possible and impossible, did not posit necessarily as two opposite poles, but they were constantly shifting and changing as generally queer people experimented with movement, reimagined, waited, and hoped, felt hopeless, and felt stuck. After the concert and during the crackdown, Karim spent months unable to shake the feeling of being surveilled, convinced that the authorities were coming for him, which was actually very possible. He isolated himself from friends and family, changed his phone number, closed all of his social media accounts, and hid out at a friend's house. And at that moment, he also spent a lot of time researching possible futures. He told me, you open Google Maps and ask yourself, where? And it was in these moments that he laid the building blocks for a movement that was both an escape from being stuck and a movement towards a potential somewhere else. Ernest Bloch, whose work on time and temporality continues to influence thinking of potentiality, explored in his book Principles of Hope how we understand the past, present, and future. Breaking away from dominant narratives that posit time as linear, Bloch contended that people's relationship to the future is informed by the practice of what he called venturing beyond, a sort of wandering, to go back to the title, into an imagined somewhere else or sometime else. Karim continues to tell me it has been months and I don't think I can stay here anymore. I spent so much time researching online, building a life somewhere else down to every detail, the rent of the house where I will be living, what I will be eating and drinking. My life in Egypt is over. I look at the houses and feel like nothing. And in this context, Karim's detachment from his immediate time space, his family, his friends, his life world, is his way of creating a space for what may come. He inscribed his desires onto an imagined somewhere else, a country on a Google map that offers the potential for renewed possibility, a territory where mobility and becoming are possible. So basically, I hope that the idea of the labyrinth, I decided to start with that idea of the labyrinth to try and explain like the multitude of ways that people can imagine and the multitude of ways that we can think of movement, because this labyrinth doesn't necessarily have an end point. It's mostly very multi-layered and it keeps shifting and changing. So I'll stop here for now.
Thanks so much, Yara. Such an interesting input. I mean, some of these questions that you're posing are just really, really fantastic. You know, thinking about, you know, what new dynamics and processes are revealed when we think about queer migration beyond this kind of kinetic movement between point A and point B. It's such an interesting idea. And also this idea of like, how can we, you know, make space for the imaginative and the effective when we're trying to theorize queer movement. It's just really great ideas. And I do encourage everyone to make sure they read Yara's chapter once it comes out. It is a really fascinating piece of scholarship. Okay, next we have Bee Kaminga, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the African Centre for Migration and Society here in Johannesburg. Over to you, Bee.
Thank you, John. Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of Yara's work, so I also think, I mean, you can find some other works of Yara's on the internet, and I would really recommend reading her stuff. So I work largely with trans migrants and refugees, and in recent years I've started working with kind of online archives and their digital projects and projections of self. And my chapter, it forms around a kind of ethical issue that I've run into in using these archives, and it's kind of prompted me about a broader ethical issue I think many of us may experience in different ways regarding using digital archives and working with trans migrants and asylum seekers. So in 2004, two seemingly unconnected events took place. The first iteration of what would quickly become the world's largest and most prestigious beauty pageant in the world for transgender women had its inaugural show in Thailand. Thousands of kilometers away, a trans woman named Miss Sahara left Nigeria for London, believing that if she didn't escape her country of origin, her next suicide attempt would be her final one. Skip forward 7 years, and the words, "I am contestant number 2, and I am representing the giant of Africa, Nigeria," carried across the self-same stage for the first time in the pageant's history. This day was not only significant for the pageant, which had never had an entrant from the African continent, let alone crowned a Black woman, but for the entrant from Abuja, a refugee now living in the UK. This was her moment to announce herself to the world as both trans and Nigerian. An immediate strong contender using the international press, the pageant functioned as a platform specifically and strategically chosen by Ms. Sahara as a place to establish herself as the first transgender Nigerian. Though she had gone to win several crowns, this moment was the one which brought her into the purview of the Nigeria she had left, and in particular its tabloid press, where she soon became an obsession. As she explains in the heinously named Sky Television documentary, which was filmed as part of that year's pageant called Lady Boys, wearing this banner or sash, names Nigeria, I am making a statement saying, I'm here, I am proud, I'm a transgender woman, and this is who I am. You say it doesn't exist in Nigeria, it does exist in Nigeria. They see it as immoral and wrong, and I feel we've been given a great opportunity here at Miss International Queen to celebrate ourselves as trans women. Articles coinciding with the pageant, providing a particular archive increasingly focused as they are on transgender people who have fled Nigeria, seeking asylum in the global north, began to appear pretty swiftly around that time. And these are examples of some of the headlines you can find that are not uncommon. At the same time, as these articles started appearing, there was a very definite focus on Ms. Sahara herself. So this is kind of, I mean, this is internet content from the time right up until, I think you could Google right now and click news and you would find similar articles about Ms. Sahara. So in this archive, fragments of Ms. Sahara's life, as you can see, appear filtered through a deeply misogynistic, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic lens. And these are some of the ones that I've picked. I actually had to curate these so as to ensure they were less triggering. So she is present in this archive because she is, in a sense, she represents that which the Nigerian state would deny as existing, a transgender woman who is also Nigerian. The Minister of Arts and Culture of Nigeria was actually asked at the time of her entering the pageant what he thought about her entrance, and he is on record as stating that if she's transgender, she can't be Nigerian, and if she's Nigerian, she can't possibly be transgender. This archive is of critical importance, not only in its relation to trans history on the African continent, but specifically trans women and trans acknowledgement within Nigeria. But in working with this archive, I've been faced with several ethical issues. I don't have time to go into all of them here, so I'm going to touch on two: dead naming and citation. I believe I'm faced with these particular issues because of three interweaving dynamics. Firstly, this archive is freely available online, so there's no archivist. The way in which she's written about is violent and traumatic. And because she's transgender, an identity considered illegal in Nigeria, and a refugee, someone who's fled, she actually has no recourse to holding the tabloids accountable. In transgender studies, you can't really consider the archive without turning to the work of K.J. Rawson. In his explanation of what an archive is, Rawson opens up to the question of naming. Rawson, and I quote, "And what of the history that is hoped to be forgotten? Transgender people who transition their gender presentation may feel betrayed by the archive's stubborn and insistent refusal to forget. Thus, while archiving transgender materials is important for community and personal identity formation, political advocacy, and historical memory, it should be treated as a powerful mechanism of memory and identity with far-reaching impacts." As you can see from the scattering of headlines, more often than not, it's not even the content of the article that is traumatic, but the very headline, many of which give Ms. Sahara's dead name. This led me to wonder, how is it that we actually know dead names more generally? More than that, though, what do we as researchers and archivists do with names? In discussion with colleagues, some people pointed out that in a sense, the Pope and Mother Teresa actually have dead names, but we're far less interested in knowing, acknowledging, and even using these. I mean, I guess that the majority of people here probably don't know the Mother Teresa's dead name or Pope John. Why not? These details are available, but we don't know them offhand. But for trans people, it's different, especially when we work with trans archives. If you have read about trans people historically, it seems almost inevitable that a sentence will appear saying formerly known as or once named as. Why is that? As many trans people will attest to, hearing or seeing one's old name can induce a visceral sense of terror. I have the same relationship with my own dead name. How then could I do the same with hers? What I mean to point to here is that there seems to be a disconnect in the way trans archives are approached and our present expectation regarding the ways in which we treat and acknowledge trans people. As one Twitter user noted, literally no other group of people has a mass of assholes insisting on using a name they no longer want to use. The only purpose of intentional dead naming is harassment, no matter how good faith you think it is. I had to ask myself, and I think this is an important question that more researchers should be asking themselves more often, am I an asshole? My approach in this has been to redact the dead name from the name of the articles and headlines, to take what I've called citational license. There are ways in which archivists are able to protect names in archives. As we engage with the internet without the archivists acting as our compass, the responsibility then must become ours. By inserting the verb dead naming rather than simply redacting with the noun dead name, I also intend to indicate an act of violence on the part of journalists and tabloids here. It's not enough, but it's a start in terms of trying to circumvent the obvious violence of this archive. Indeed, the single most harmful misconception about transgender people, and one which these tabloids attempt to consistently instate, are that our true gender identities, who we are at our core, are the ones assigned at birth. To use these headlines without redaction would be, to a certain degree, to give some sort of validation to what Ms. Zahara herself has called the trashy behavior of this archive. Of course, URLs are usually repetitions of headlines. So if I struggle with the dead naming of this archive, how do I begin to even point to it? It's not just the URL. The contents of these articles actually go far beyond dead naming and include discussions of genitals, images of random men as pre-transition images, and suggestions of indecency. And lastly, a quite common article is to have many pictures of Ms. Zahara taken from her Instagram and Facebook without her permission, obviously. And then with the last image being of a random man with the words, "but she was a man," emblazoned on top of it. Here, there does seem to be some precedent. Addie Kunstman, in her book, Figurations of Violence and Belonging, Queerness, Migranthood, and Nationalism in Cyberspace and Beyond, in a footnote adds that she doesn't provide URLs of the discussion thread she talks about in order to protect participants. Sadia Hartman, in talking about her own archives of scandal and excess, questions absence and the violated body who we cite and what that tells us about the narratives we need. Drawing from African feminist thought in particular, I believe it's crucial we consider the role that intellectuals, researchers, and the academy have in validating particular, usually dominant forms of power through writing, or in this case, simply being brought through the front door of the academy, a space where those being written about, in this instance, trans people, rarely make it. Denai Mapotso refers to this as a key element of African feminist intellectual ethics. And following from this, Neo Masangi urges us not to reinscribe our variously condemned statuses, to not use our power in the service of an archive that would do more harm than good. For Masangi to write on being gender non-conforming, and this has been important for my own work, and from the African continent, one must become undisciplined. In thinking through these and other ethical constraints I experienced in trying to write about Zahara, I realized that perhaps one of the reasons we as archivists and researchers are so willing to dead name is because usually the person is dead. This is for many one of the critical elements of the archives they work with. In coming to the realization, it dawned on me that in my case, Ms. Zahara is very much alive and in fact part of my own extended community. Kagura Machari reminds us that there is much routine despair concerning the fact that academic writing cannot intervene in real world situations. But what if it could? So I met with Ms. Zahara, to have a drink, and we discussed the project and the things I'd been writing. And she told me three things that I think are important to the story. First, the dead name passed around in Nigerian media is incorrect. To this end, she preferred it was redacted, although she would like it also flagged in a footnote that it's inaccurate. Secondly, she's aware of the necessity of this archive and my own struggles over citation. She pointed out that although the issue of a representation was predominantly within Nigeria, there had been also incidences in the UK. For instance, the Ladyboy documentary, which I mentioned in the beginning, she explained that this for her was never actually cleared, and one of the reasons she has been disinclined to work with British media since. Lastly, and maybe most critically, she agreed with all the steps I've taken so far. The question then became one of voice and power, mine and hers, and of course, theirs, the tabloid media. And so in our conversation, it dawned on us that maybe what was necessary was an informal guide to our archive, a letter, one which could provide some of the necessary interventions. I'm not suggesting this is by any means a panacea to some of the ethical problems I've presented, but perhaps one way to try and bridge past, present, and future. So when this chapter is published, it will include the following text from Ms. Sahara, a sort of will to her future archive. And so she has written at the end of this chapter, to those who may access or use this archive in the future, I wish to make the following clear as a trans woman from Nigeria living in the diaspora. I've always been female. I did not have any epiphany of self-discovery after living in one gender all my life. My body has never been wrong. I'm a woman. Whoever uses this archive in the future, I request they redact all names other than Ms. Sahara. Though none of these other names are mine, their use is intended to do violence and to treat my gender as somehow false. Redacting these names also affects how these websites are referenced, since removing them from the headline means removing them from the URL. I request this is also done as has been done in this article. Lastly, as a woman, my pronouns are she and her. As with dead naming, the use of any other pronouns is an effort to degrade me. I would like my pronouns treated in the same way as my dead name. I think this is a really important intervention, an example of the ways in which we can work with trans refugees and asylum seekers in the diaspora, particularly those who are creating content about themselves. I also think that Ms. Sahara gives us a number of clues here about what it means to be trans and from the African continent, and really speaks back to a broader narrative that we see being kind of taken out around the world by some famous writers from the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea. Such a fascinating input. I mean, some of these questions about how we might, ethically engage with trauma and violence in the archive are just so critical. But I think what I also like about this input is just this reminder of the way in which queer and trans Africans in the diaspora are projecting new identity formations and signifying practices back at the continent, and just challenging this idea that movement, whether it's of ideas or people or bodies, just happens in one way. And I think it's such a great reminder. Okay, on to our third presentation. I would like to introduce Emmanuel Muyaro Kumbuzu, who is a faculty member at the African Leadership University in Rwanda. Take it away, Emmanuel. I think you're still on mute.
I was on mute. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'll try to get my presentation going because I've been really struggling to put everything in 10 minutes. As John just introduced me, my name is Emmanuel and I'm from Rwanda, and the chapter that is going to be published in the upcoming work Bea and John are editing is entitled Kindness is a Distant and Elusive Reality, Charting the Impacts of Discrimination on the Mental and Sexual Well-Being of LGBT Refugee Youth in Kenya. So of course, my name is Emmanuel. I did not do this work alone, so I have to recognize Professor Margaret Juko, who is with the University of Rwanda School of Journalism and Communication, as well as James Maingi Gathatwa, who is a program officer at Hoimas in Kenya, which is a community-based organization. So this is the order in which I'm going to structure my short presentation. So I'll start with the context, the research gap we're trying to cover, to bridge, the objective of the study, the connection of the theme with the theme of today's webinar, and for the research findings, I'll talk about salient mental and sexual health issues, the coping mechanism of the LGBT refugees we encountered in Kenya, as well as their access to healthcare services. This presentation will definitely end with a short reflection and some recommendations. So the study is going to be, or was based in Kenya, which is one of the East African countries. And all the countries in the East African community have issues with rights, LGBT rights, and some of them do not even have any protection whatsoever. So that's to demonstrate that hostility. I will just mention high-profile people who have voiced very, very strong assertions or statements towards LGBT rights. So first cite late President Magufuli, the current President Yoweri Museveni, as well as David Bahati, who is behind the Kill the Gay bills that was introduced in 2014. Even though the LGBT people we encountered in Kenya have various issues of discrimination, it is important to recognize that there are Kenyan activists who are doing a phenomenal job. There are researchers who are conducting research in that country, and there are also health organizations that are doing their best to make sure people have the right sexual health care, mental health care in that country. So not everything is negative in that country, and I thought it was important to mention this during this short presentation. So to date, research has concentrated on the difficulties LGBT Africans face when engaging with dehumanizing asylum bureaucracies, especially barriers to proving eligibility for protection. Very little attention has been afforded to the health and well-being of LGBT refugees, many of whom have histories of trauma and violence. So this is the gap we try to bridge with this research, whose objective is unpacking the impacts of alienation and victimization on LGBT refugee youth living in Nairobi, Kenya, with a special focus or emphasis on their mental and sexual well-being, because well-being is not just the lack of disease, but it's also an environment and a reality where people can actually thrive. So you must be wondering the connection between my presentation today with today's theme. I believe, or we believe, that poor mental and sexual well-being are closely related to queer forced migration, either as catalysts or outcomes. So when people are having all these stresses in their home countries, when people are having all the difficulties in their home country, it affects their mental health, and then they flee the country. And sadly, in some of the countries they go, they also find similar stresses. So that's how I think today's theme is linked to my presentation. So when it comes to the health issues, we talked to these people, and some of the salient issues included depression and psychosis for mental health, and other sexual health issues included HIV and treatable sexually transmitted diseases. And some of the causes of both mental health issues as well as sexual health issues include lack of integration. These people do not feel at home in these new countries they're in. And specifically, we're talking about Kenya. They do not feel at home. They come from all over East Africa, the countries that I've mentioned earlier, but they still do not feel home. But we should also mention that many of them come from Uganda, which is, and it started in 2005, if I'm correct with the dates, when the Kill the Gays bill was first introduced. So they are mistreated by service providers. They feel stuck. And I think Yara, the first presenter, mentioned this feeling of being stuck when she talked about the mobilities in impossible geographies. So last but not least on this list, because I think, don't know how I'm doing with time, limited service provision. So there might be some good available services, but they're still limited. It's not enough. When you consider the demand, the services are not enough. So how do these people cope with all these issues? Some of them choose or opt to self-isolation, which in itself has many problems related to it. But many people, many LGBT youth we spoke to in Nairobi mentioned this as one of their coping mechanisms. So peer support networks, these can be church groups, these can be other groups in the community where people can actually go and feel like they have a family, feel like they have people who can listen to them. So living together in high walled compounds or houses also gives them a sense of privacy and protection. So prayer and other non-medical interventions are also some of the coping mechanisms. Unfortunately, the coping mechanisms are not all positive, because some of them indulge in drug and alcohol, and we can talk about weed and cat, which many of them call mira or muguka in local language. So yes, there are some available services, and the people we spoke to demonstrated a clear knowledge of distribution of safe sex materials, specifically condoms and personal lubricants. However, the existence of these services does not mean that they have equitable access. There are still issues related to lack of information. Many LGBT people do not know which services are available to them. And some of these services are not LGBT friendly, and there are still issues related to homophobic service providers based on the misconceptions they have. For instance, if a gay man went to one of these centers, a healthcare provider or a service provider would tell them, you chose to be gay, so serving you is contrary to my beliefs. So some people also cite the influence of evangelical churches from America. Some other people in research have also cited issues to do with the misinterpretation of cultural values or African cultural values. Many of these refugees in Kenya, they also experience dangers when they try to go to these centers, either in transit or when they get there and meet homophobic service providers. So the cost, some of them have to think about, do I go to this healthcare facility, or do I need to use this money I would use for transport at least to get a meal for today? So it's quite difficult. And last but not least, there are still no specialized mental health services available to the LGBT youth we spoke to in Nairobi, Kenya. So I'll finish quickly this presentation with some reflections and recommendations. The people we spoke to all said that they would like a streamlined resettlement process because they feel like they were in limbo. And they want more access to affirming healthcare, both physically and emotionally, because some of them live very far from where these facilities are and they do not have enough money to get there. And emotionally, when they get there, they are quite triggered in various ways, which doesn't really help them seek mental and sexual health services, because they are deterred from seeking them. So they also want better dissemination of information about affirming healthcare services. They would like organizations, including community-based organization and frontline health workers, to be sensitized on LGBT issues, because these are the people who actually give them services. So they want the promotion of non-medical community-based therapies, because these non-medical therapies have proven to be effective in various African settings. They also want some income generating activities so that they do not feel like they have to depend on other people in a country where they're not even allowed to seek employment. So they would also like some safe spaces where they can meet on a weekly basis to share updates on what's going on in their lives and discover each other's talents and how they could potentially help each other cope with the stresses they meet in their daily lives. So one of the things they said is also that sometimes there is some help that doesn't get to them because there's lack of traceability, and therefore they advocated for the introduction of a biometric cash transfer scheme. And also they want the UNHCR to resume direct financial support because it had been suspended. So I'll take this opportunity to thank ALMN and specifically B, who presented before me, and John, who introduced this webinar, for the great work they did in helping us polish our chapter. I also thank Governing Intimacies Project for the opportunity to share with you my or our work, other presenters in this webinar, and everybody on the call for your kind attention. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. That was very, very interesting. I think what I like most about both your chapter and this presentation is that it reminds us of something that's seemingly pretty obvious, but goes largely unacknowledged. And that's the fact that many queer and trans people who are on the move are young people, and they face very specific challenges based on their age in many circumstances. I think so often in the literature, you know, people get homogenized under this kind of big umbrella of queer or trans migrant, and we don't think about these nuances and specificities that are really, really important. And we see the same thing when we fixate so much on the endpoints or starting points of migration without thinking about what happens in between and the consequences that might have. And in this case, you and your co-authors write so beautifully about how young people in Kenya are navigating and negotiating, you know, a really complex social context. And yeah, really, really beautiful insights. So well done, and thank you very much. We do have quite a few questions coming in. Let me just have a look at them all. There's a general one here, first of all, from Sean. Maybe we'll start with that and then I can kind of bring them together for specific individuals. But Sean wanted to know what the panelists' thoughts are on the far-reaching and potentially devastating impact of Ghana's proposed anti-gay bill on the LGBTQIA+ community, gay advocacy, and the violation of a host of rights, such as the rights to privacy, dignity, equality, and life. Would any of the panelists like to have a go at responding to that? Or maybe we can give it some thought as I go through the more specific questions.
I mean, I'm happy to talk to it.
By all means. Fire away.
I think it's a great question, Sean, and it's a question I think every 2 or 3 years we have to ask ourselves there. And there seems to me a shift to be happening, and it's something, the discussion we've been having, and Raul certainly picks up on it in his book, on when states move beyond the penal code and are now implementing laws that are of their own making and of their own desires. And we can no longer blame this on, oh, it was colonialism. We now have to think about who is states actually taking responsibility and practicing a kind of intimidation and criminalization of these communities. I think that the Ghanaian bill is something we should be super concerned about, because it takes what the Ugandan bill did, which was criminalize not just LGBT people, but their families and friends for not turning them in, for housing them. And we see that as a major push factor. But the Ghanaian bill goes even further in that it criminalizes, it particularly focuses on trans people. So it criminalizes transition, it criminalizes cross-dressing. It has particular nuances to it that I don't think we've seen before in these kinds of approaches to criminalization. I think what's also interesting with the Ghanaian bill is that we've seen a very different, I don't know if there's a great song that's Angel Maxine, who's a Ghanaian trans woman, has released a song and about the bill. And I mean, one of the lyrics is that you should consider that people are having, there are no children on this call now, that you should consider that people in your home might be having anal sex. That's one of the lyrics. And Angel lives in Ghana, and her family has spoken quite openly about accepting her. So there's a very strange way in which this bill is unfolding, but I think it's something we definitely should be concerned about. And the ways in which it is there has been discussion that the bill is actually in response to the, decriminalization in particular countries, and that this is a push back to say that Ghana is not going to follow as the country that found independence first. It is refusing as the kind of the oldest to move away from criminalization.
Emmanuel, would you like to respond as well? I see you've got your hand up.
Just very quickly to reflect on the fact that when bills like this, I do not fully know what the bill is all about, other than what B has just explained. But what is scary is the fact that somebody's liking is turned into law, and it has repercussions that they do not anticipate even themselves. So we should be scared of this and many other laws that are like that, because all they do is stifle people and actually diminish the few of the rights people had. Thank you.
And just to add on, to abuse my time, and obviously we don't know yet how it's going to play out in relation to asylum and migration. But I think one of the things we need to do is to make sure we look back and see some of the lessons learnt from responses of activist networks and communities internationally to other attempts to heighten criminalisation, such as in Uganda, some of the negative impacts that had both on people in country and on how asylum was handled at different times. And to, what was my second point I was going to make? And to think about what happens when we start moving again into this kind of hierarchical listing of what's the worst place, who then is more eligible for asylum and things like that, and some of the impacts it can have when we, again, like I was trying to say in the introduction, move away from questions of nuance and how that might impact a whole range of dynamics related to migration. There is a question here for B, which we might go to next. So this is from Kaio, who says, you raise important questions about agency and archive making, which are very relevant to any debates on archives, not only queer archives. He wonders what are your thoughts around social media as a form of self-curated archive. There is agency in its making, but once this archive is put in place, it can be misappropriated, as in the case of the photographs you spoke of and shared. What are differences between anonymous queer people and queer people who have achieved a celebrity status of sorts?
Thanks, Kaya. I think inevitably we pivot more towards celebrity archives, or archives that are, in 50 years' time, people are more likely to write about Miss Sahara than they are about a singular person who might have created an Instagram feed about their transition in Nigeria. The difference, I think, is the ways in which these archives can be used and usurped, because there's no way of holding accountability. Either one can be used in whatever way, and often for nefarious means. And there are like lesser known celebrities who have similar things done to them. I suppose there's a question here as well around what constitutes an archive. Does a certain amount of interest from an external force create an archive? Can an archive for instance, is my Instagram an archive? And is it of interest to anyone other than myself and like the 10 other people that most of whom are my family? The difference, I think, is the desire to use that for particular means. And I think for many people who are now writing about archives from 50, 100 years ago, what is the language that we're using to talk about those archives? What identities are we trying to press onto those people, and how have they been taken up elsewhere? And what has their circulation given us in terms of the ways in which we understand how people could have lived and access particular things? So I think that that's the kind of difference between the two.
Brilliant. I think that was a really good response. There is another fantastic panel question for the whole panel, and I think it'll be a good way to bring everyone into the conversation. Kaio says, it seems that queer mobility is always connected to certain forms of immobility, that need to be negotiated and eventually overcome, especially in the case of people who are stuck, as Yara was mentioning before. It seems that class position or economic status play a strong role in determining how one is able to address a situation of immobility. Can you all elaborate on the role that class plays in your case studies? Anyone like to have a stab? Emmanuel, go for it.
Class is not something I really saw, but I think we can think about the mobilities of people in developing countries in general. And if people in general are somehow limited to the places they can go to, I think the layer of being LGBT, the layer of being vulnerable is also adds on to that already difficult situation of not being able to go wherever people want to go. Because I remember I was in another discussion where they talked about the fact that academics from the South do not always have the possibility of accessing conferences in the West. So now think about a refugee, a young person in Nairobi, Kenya. Some of them never finished their education. Some of them do not have any financial resources. I think that adds up to how difficult it's going to be for them to even have access to any mobility. However, there are many organizations that are working in that space to make sure people are able to navigate this difficult or perilous journey. But coming back to my particular study, I did not really think about class, but I would say that the people we spoke to were all vulnerable people and young and uprooted from their communities with very traumatic accounts. So I'm not sure I've been able to contribute to that, but if I haven't explained, I'm happy to clarify further. Thank you.
B or Yara, did you want to add on any comments about this issue of class and how it relates to both mobility and immobility, especially for those who may be stuck?
I mean, in my work, there is some, I'm trying to think, it's not a fully formed thought. For many of the LGBT people we see from the continent arrive in the global north, a lot of that is facilitated by conferences or NGO work. And we know as well that LGBT NGOs are the #1 employers of LGBT people across the African continent, particularly in the areas of HIV and health work. And that allows for a certain level of class mobility. We also know that people who have, if I look at the kind of people I do research with who have this form of celebrity status, whether it's Bob Risky in Nigeria or Veso Golden and even Angel Maxine, there is in Ghana, there is a level at which LGBT people seem to be able to rise financially and in that zone are able to either pay for protection or have a form of protection. So there is definitely a class aspect to who is generally seen seeking asylum, and money is definitely an aspect that allows for protection, but also allows for a wider range of choice as to when you choose to seek asylum, when you choose to get a visa and buy a ticket versus when you have to cross a border and try and move through a number of countries to reach a safe haven.
Hi, Yara, please join the conversation.
Hi. Well, it was very tricky because I tried to approach it. I mean, it's also not a very well formulated thought, but I really liked your question, Kayo. But it came up several times. The problem is with my case study, there was an issue with access because of like security issues. So I had to like mostly snowball sampling. So it wasn't really like a very diverse group of people I talked to, but generally when I talked about it or like thought about it, I feel like it's really important, at least within the context of thinking about dreaming, to think of how of what people imagine and what they dream of is affected by the possibilities and impossibilities that the frames of value has afforded them. So these frames of value can be intersections between race and socioeconomic background, gender, sexuality, and how all of these things intersect. And so we have to consider what bodies at least can actually migrate or seek asylum, and which bodies can't, and which bodies can't imagine seeking asylum or migrating. So I mean, I don't necessarily know if that kind of answered. Yeah.
No, that was wonderful. That was really, really helpful. Thank you. B, did you want to speak? Okay, I saw you raise your hand. There is also a question here from Srila, but I'm not actually sure who it's relating to. I don't think it's a general question. I don't know if maybe Srila would like to pose the question to someone in particular. I'm not really sure how it. There's so many messages, it's hard for me to follow what's going on. Sure. Okay, we do have another question from Gavin, who is saying that they're interested in thinking about the language that queer and trans migrants in and from Africa use to talk about their mobility. We know that often migrants need to adopt certain language to tell their stories in order to access services or navigate border regimes. But in thinking about migrant archives, I wonder if any of the speakers have come across other ways in which participants talked about and imagined their mobilities. For context, Gavin has been thinking about the work that Imaginations of Exile did for many South Africans abroad during the apartheid era. So yeah, again, thinking about the language and identifying terms that people have come across in their work.
A lot of the people that I work with, and it's a chapter that I'm kind of trying to figure out, specifically talk about transition in exile. And as though there is a desire to come into the fullness of oneself as a trans person in country of origin, and that there is no chance of that. So it's a very particular sentence about transition in exile, and a feeling that, and a concern around, if I transition here in this, wherever it is, somewhere in Europe or North America, what does that do about my eventual possibility in terms of who I am to return to families, friends, country of origin? Because I mean, as many of the chapters in the book show us, it's not all doom and gloom. Many mothers adore their children and are sponsoring these journeys to countries next door or to elsewhere, and stay in contact with their children, and are overwhelmed and joyous when their daughter says, well, I'm actually a trans woman and I'm transitioning in this country. So I like that the strand around exile, and I've been thinking a lot recently about because we think of the trans narrative, particularly in the global north, as this like linear trajectory from A to B, and often in the global north you go somewhere else, Thailand, and in the past it used to be Morocco, to kind of transition, and then you return to your country of origin. And there's something different that happens here, and this idea around exile, I think, is really important.
Do any of the other panelists have something to add to that conversation? I might just add on myself. I mean, I haven't shared my chapter in this presentation, Gavin, but I mainly use a lot of arts-based methodologies. And the chapter in my book looks at a narrative writing and zine making project. And I think one of the most interesting things that emerged from that project and other similar projects I've done is just the way in which many queer and trans migrants and asylum seekers in South Africa specifically have been resisting and reappropriating and using different legal categories and identity terms in various ways, sometimes consciously to push back against the limitations of those categories and the way they feel that doesn't reflect their lived experiences, but also sometimes in ways that create new understandings of what these categories mean and how we might deploy them, and what some of the negative impacts can be when we rely so heavily on particular identifiers and terminology. But it's hard to talk about without having presented my chapter. But yeah, I think that comes up again and again in the book. And so, yes, there are many chapters there you can look at. Okay, I think we've got one more question from Adrienne, who says, how do queer and trans African mobilities shape new connections between communities in various African countries and between the continent and the diaspora? Does it help to imagine and establish a sense of queer Pan-Africanism? It's a very big question, but I'm sure we have some wonderful reflections on it. Emmanuel, please go for it.
The people we spoke to in Nairobi, Kenya, were predominantly from Uganda. And as I mentioned in my presentation, they moved to Nairobi because of the Kill the Gays bill that was introduced in 2014. But what I realized speaking to them now that I think about it is that they would tell you, oh, they are brothers from this place, they are brothers from Burundi, they are brothers from this and this. And they also had an issue of language because they didn't speak the local language, which is Kiswahili in Kenya. Many of them had to express themselves in English. So I think there's a sense of community because whenever anything happened to them, it didn't discriminate. They were all refugee and they were all LGBT. So it kind of drew them closer. So talking about the Pan-Africanism, I think there was an online queer festival or pride event that actually brought people together. So people from the diaspora, people from the continent, people across languages. I'm talking about our colonial past. We had Lusophone people, we had Francophone people, we had people who use English. So I think there's that sense in various spaces, even though I did not see it specifically in the research and the interviews we had with our respondents. I think there's that sense of queer people on the continent organizing themselves and understanding that there are issues, even though they relate to the global queer community, there's also some peculiarities that are specific to the continent and to the African diaspora. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think B had raised their hand as well. Do you want to add on?
Yeah, I think we might have to think of a queer migrant Pan-Africanism. I think we still see a massive gap between migrants and asylum seekers and queer or LGBT communities in country. So in whether it's Senegal or Kenya or even South Africa, we don't see local LGBT groups into or allowing or inviting migrant groups to integrate with them. In the diaspora, you're more likely to see, and I'm thinking of a group that I work with in Sweden called Queer Station, who are a group of trans migrants and refugees, largely from Southern Africa, but from very many countries. In Kenya, we've heard local Kenyan organizations be quite disparaging about the refugee and asylum community. And also, I'm thinking of when the the cold case for the penal code was happening, and the refugees and asylum seekers were specifically asked not to come to the courts because it would look like you came to fix a problem in our country you couldn't fix in your own. And in South Africa, we see also a divide between, it feels like we constantly have to remind LGBT groups that asylum seekers are also part of their community. So it seems when everyone is in a, when no one is a citizen by default, they're more likely to fall into a kind of Pan-Africanist queer community. But when there is someone who is a citizen of a place, I would argue that they are less inclined towards a kind of integration into that kind of Pan-Africanist queer idea.
Wonderful, thanks so much. We do have 2 more questions. You're all in the hot seat today. This one is specifically for Yara, and it comes from B. And B wants to know if you can speak a little bit more about what it's like to do research in a place that you live and where others want to leave or dream of seeking asylum from. So just that dynamic of negotiating research in a place that you are based in when people are dreaming of elsewhere or potentially making plans to leave.
Thank you for the question. I mean, it was interesting because, like, at some point, it seemed like I was part of that. Like, there was this autoethnography involved in that process of my research, where, and like, the lines between researcher friendships have kind of blurred, and it was really interesting because after I even finished like my fieldwork, I kept learning about how these processes of imagining and planning evolved, let's say. And for some, it wasn't only like seeking migration and then migrating, but also like these shifts, like I had mentioned in the presentation, where people like have already moved out of their parents' house into this like more of a into themselves, let's say, geography that's created more aligned to these desires and the desires in their imaginaries that they were seeking. So it, like this, at the beginning, it started about my interest in migration, but also it kind of shifted into these interests of generally mobility and how people are moving in these like micro ways. And to also observe and witness that some people migrated through, and like, I don't know, like Kayo had asked that question. I want to actually, about the socioeconomic, that I want to actually say more on, and maybe it touches a little bit about, on your question. How like there, at one point I attended this workshop a few years ago, like I think it's 2016, and it was organized by this queer organization in Egypt about migration. And there were literally on a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, where it kind of divided like a table into pros and cons of each country that you can migrate to, and all of these different ways you can migrate. And that kind of also touches on the socioeconomic, because there was these, like if you want to migrate through like seeking a university, for example, to apply to, and in a way that's also like moving away from the here, that's very much suffocating in nature for some. And there was a way where you can seek asylum, but all of the ways that people actually would navigate their asylum seeking case, for example, by literally making up all of these reports or having other people write letters for them about how they have been persecuted, and they are being persecuted, but they needed like paperwork to prove this persecution in some sense. But I mean, this kind of touches on the socioeconomic and who can afford to take on which route for migration, but also in that idea of being really like seeing all the different ways that people are still imagining and moving, because the field is with me in a sense, or at least part of it is with me, and I'm part of that field. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers that question, but yeah.
Yeah, it certainly did answer it. It was really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. We do have one final question from Sean, who said that they would like to know more about the psychological impacts that queer and trans migrants suffer. Also, more on the positive impact when the country they migrate to is receptive and accommodating of them. So, I mean, perhaps Emmanuel would like to start us off maybe about some of the psychological impacts, and then if others want to join in, maybe they can, but no pressure.
Okay, I'll just start. I think from our research, they talked about depression, they talked about psychosis, they talked about like constant fear, they talked about paranoia, which actually prevents them from going to access the services they should be accessing, because they anticipate that they are going to be discriminated against. So it's quite big, and it starts from their childhood, where they have to be to play a double personality, like be themselves and also be who they are expected to be. So all that is damaging. So and when they go to these new countries, even people who are not refugees, I think it takes time to accommodate all the changes that are happening in their lives, and also to be able to start a new life. So all those are stresses. So add them on to the disadvantages, specifically the group of people we interviewed in Kenya. Many of them had not finished their education. Many of them did not have these financial means we're talking about. So when you go into a different country with no solid education, with trauma, with all these issues, I think it's quite difficult, however accommodating it is, even though with time, I think, and some of them, I think I've been able to contact 2 of them, and I'm not sure I could use those examples to generalize, but they say that yes, it's good, but yes, the new reality has its own challenges, but they are happy they can sleep in the night. So I don't know if that was able to answer the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And I think you've hinted at something really important, and that's trying to challenge some of these adjectives and concepts such as, you know, reception and receptive and accommodating. I think there is so much effort by many countries, especially in the global north, to present themselves in a certain way as, you know, accommodating and saviors in many contexts of queer and trans folk from the African continent and elsewhere. But all of those places have very, very significant challenges, which are documented by many of the contributions to the book. And I think it's a good place to start if you're looking at wanting to complicate some of these narratives around liberation and savior and psychological relief. I think the impacts are far-reaching and take on many, many different forms. I think B wants to say something as well. I will let them have the floor before I go on too much.
I just want to also add to the question. I've just finished a project on the mental health impacts for trans refugees and migrants. And one of the outcomes of the project is quite clear that because trans people are discriminated against, obviously, in countries of origin, and have a kind of broad experience of not being able to access healthcare and security, that remains the same when they access countries of asylum. And then we have issues around xenophobia, which are added to that. So there's an inherent fear around accessing healthcare services, and there's a generalized experience of it being the same. So one of the outcomes of this project was that it seems that it's in countries of asylum, it is preferable to have peer-to-peer networks in order to assist with healthcare access and mental health in particular with trans asylum and migrants, because they're still less likely to approach mainstream healthcare. And I mean, we've seen in, I think Seema Shaksari asks in her paper on queer temporalities, you know, where will trans women from the US seek asylum? There's the ways in which transness is treated the world over. There is a question around, well, where is safety, and who is acknowledging, and who is going to provide a kind of mental health care access. So the outcomes of that project were that it really does seem to kind of stay consistent across the board, except that in countries of asylum seekers are now also having to deal with xenophobia and not just transphobia.
Brilliant, thank you, Bea. I'm afraid we are running out of time and need to wrap up. I think this is a good moment to really thank all of the presenters for taking the time to share their wonderful chapters. And to the audience for all the wonderful questions. And I think it's a good time to maybe return to those 3 questions I posed at the start, because I think each in their own way, the presentations today asked us to think again about the ways in which we conceptualize queer and trans mobilities, some of these questions around representation and what it means to both not just investigate, but also talk about in our academic work, the experiences and lives of those who have moved or in the process of moving, and also highlighting yet again the need to think beyond the law and legal critiques, which of course have their place and are really important. There's an urgent need for them to continue, but there are so many other dynamics we need to be looking at, and I think that's one of the real strengths of this collection and the papers you heard today, getting us to look beyond some of the obvious shortcomings in the application of law. So yeah, I think just to wrap up, we'd like to remind you about the collection that is coming out in early 2022. It's a wonderful collection of scholarship. It deals with experiences from across the continent as well as some further afield. And I think, yeah, it is a really good read. I can guarantee you that. So please do look out for it when it comes out early next year. So thank you again. I don't know if Kayo wants to wrap up from the governing intimacy side. I should also say that Kayo has a wonderful contribution in the book. Very good read, certainly a standout. But yeah, thank you again for listening and all of your wonderful questions, which were really, really, really thought-provoking and useful.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone. It was such an amazing panel, and I am really looking forward to reading the book. Just a quick note to say that our next webinar will happen in September 1st on the topic of reproduction and care in the Global South. We'll be publicizing soon, so stay tuned on Facebook and social media for more information. And I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Bye all.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.